The dinner table fell into a complete suffocating silence as my aunt stared at me with her wine glass hovering midway to her lips. She looked utterly baffled, her arrogant smirk evaporating into thin air. But my attention was focused entirely on my cousin Jason. He was an active Special Forces operator trained to remain calm under fire, yet right now, he looked like he was about to pass out. His face had turned completely ghost white as he stared across the floral centerpiece at me, gripping his fork so hard his knuckles were drained of color. I casually cut into my steak, taking a slow, quiet bite while the room held its breath. It was almost hilarious how badly my aunt had misjudged everything. She spent decades assuming power meant loud voices, big biceps, and dramatic stories, failing to realize that true control is dangerously quiet. She believed she dominated the room, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sitting across from the one person who controlled her son's operational green light. To understand why Jason looked so terrified, you have to look at the 2 hours leading up to that exact moment. When I arrived for the family holiday gathering, the house was already buzzing with loud, performative praise. Aunt Brenda was in her absolute element, parading Jason around in his crisp uniform while introducing him to every single guest. When she finally turned to me, she waved a dismissive hand and introduced me to a neighbor as a low-level desk worker in Washington. She made sure to mention that I was basically a glorified government secretary who just filed routine documents all day. I felt that familiar, cold anger settle in my chest as I added another mark to a very long tally of disrespect. The real tipping point happened right before dinner when she cornered me near the drinks table while holding a fresh glass of red wine. She leaned in, making sure her loud, condescending voice carried across the living room over the background music. She told me it was frustrating to watch tax dollars fund bureaucrats who sat in air-conditioned offices while real heroes like Jason bled in the field. I tried to deflect by mentioning the confidential nature of my department, but she cut me off with a cruel snort. She scoffed and claimed my silence was just a convenient cover for having an utterly boring life. I looked at her closely, realizing she genuinely believed I was nobody worth respecting. She thought she was picking on the quiet outcast of the family, never suspecting she was insulting the person who quietly monitored her son's missions. When dinner was served, Aunt Brenda took center stage as the director and star of the entire evening. She showered the room with dramatic, cinematic tales of Jason's tactical training, most of which were clearly exaggerated, judging by how intensely Jason stared down at his plate. Every time Jason attempted to offer a mild correction to her wild claims, she completely steamrolled right over him. Soon enough, the spotlight shifted directly onto me, turning the atmosphere from heroic praise to patronizing pity. Aunt Brenda looked over with a sad, tight smile, describing my daily routine as a tragic waste of potential among filing cabinets and spreadsheets. She offered a fake sigh, commenting that at least my government job provided decent dental benefits to make up for such a boring existence. I took a slow sip of water, letting my mind drift far away from the dining room to the secure concrete vault where I spent my workdays. Aunt Brenda believed I sat in a tiny cubicle farm, but in reality, I worked inside a high-security facility deep within joint military intelligence operations. I was not a secretary or an administrative assistant. I was a senior targeting authorization officer responsible for reviewing high-stakes tactical strikes. While ground operators were the physical force, I was the legal gatekeeper who determined whether a mission actually moved forward. My daily work involved analyzing live surveillance feeds, tracking high-value targets, and ensuring absolute legal compliance before any action was taken. I remembered a night 6 months prior, sitting in front of flickering monitors in a pitch-black room at 3 a.m. We were tracking a major high-value target entering a compound, and a high-ranking officer was standing right behind my chair, shouting at me to authorize an immediate strike. I reviewed the thermal imagery carefully and noticed heat signatures matching young children in the adjacent room. The officer demanded I sign off before the target moved, but I held my ground and declared a tactical abort due to civilian presence. I refused to yield to the immense pressure, saving innocent lives and preventing a catastrophic disaster for the entire unit. Back at the dinner table, Aunt Brenda snapped me out of my memory with another jab about my wrists hurting from endless typing. I looked at my hands, the very hands that held firm against a furious commander, and chose to keep my composure. As dinner continued, the alcohol dissolved whatever mild filter my aunt had left, prompting her to turn up the hostility. She leaned across the table, loudly asking Jason to tell me a story about sleeping in the mud so I could appreciate my comfortable desk chair. Jason winced, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, clearly embarrassed by his mother's behavior as he softly asked her to stop. He tried to defend me by saying my government work was important, but he offered the defense with a pitying tone because he had no idea what I actually did. Aunt Brenda pounced on his hesitation, scoffing loudly and telling the table that I simply organized office parties and filed receipts. Those words hung in the air, triggering years of feeling overlooked, ignored, and dismissed by a family that viewed me as secondary. I put my fork down softly against the fine china, realizing that trying to reason with her using normal words was completely pointless. She only understood social status and power, while Jason understood clearance levels, operational authorities, and real command structure. I looked directly at my cousin, deciding in that moment to stop acting like the quiet relative and start acting like the senior authority figure I was. Aunt Brenda purred with fake affection, telling me to just admit that my life was small so everyone could move on. I took a slow sip of my drink, allowing the awkward silence to stretch across the table until every eye was fixed on me. I calmly stated that I did not file paperwork, but instead supervised high-risk operational parameters and legal authorizations during active deployments. Aunt Brenda burst into a harsh, loud laugh, mocking me open-mouthed and asking if I thought I was working for a top-secret agency. She looked around expecting everyone to laugh along with her, but the room stayed dead quiet as I shifted my focus entirely to Jason. I caught his gaze, making sure he understood that our normal family dynamic had just been replaced by the strict hierarchy of military command. I quietly told him that while I did not use a fancy title around family, my tactical routing identifier in the network was Ghost 90. The reaction was instantaneous, as if an invisible wave had struck the table with brutal force. Jason froze instantly, his fork slipping from his fingers and crashing onto his plate with a sharp metallic clang. All the color drained from his face within seconds, leaving him looking thoroughly shaken and pale. To a civilian, those words meant nothing. But to a special operator, that specific designator represented the supreme authority capable of approving or canceling live support in the field. Aunt Brenda looked completely bewildered, glancing between my calm expression and her terrified son while asking why that silly name mattered. Jason swallowed hard, turning to his mother with wide, desperate eyes as he softly told her to stop speaking immediately. He nervously explained to her that Ghost 90 was not a low-level worker, but the high-ranking operational authority who controlled mission approvals, equipment funding, and support assets. He explicitly told his mother that my structural authority sat far above his entire chain of command. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the entire room, leaving Aunt Brenda sitting frozen with her mouth slightly open. The artificial hierarchy she had built her pride upon had completely collapsed right in front of her. I carefully folded my napkin and placed it gently on the table, the soft movement signaling that the evening was officially over. I stood up calmly, checked my tactical watch, and mentioned that I had an early morning strategic briefing to attend. I thanked Aunt Brenda politely for the dinner, turned to Jason, and reminded him to verify his communication protocols before his next rotation. He did not treat me like a cousin. He reflexively sat up straight, nodded respectfully, and answered with formal protocol. I walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of their stunned stares without feeling an ounce of judgment or self-doubt. Driving home in the quiet dark, I realized I did not need flashy recognition, because true power speaks for itself without ever needing to shout.